There is a huge confusion between a leader and leadership. So therefore, one has to understand today's context and understand how this has come to be. Why are we here?
Like the creativity today is not regenerative creativity. It's creativity is like cleverness.
The external is clearly a reflection of the internal. Nutmeg's curse.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, you should read it if you want to feel depressed about life. And today it's very, very clear. There is no other. All the cost that you're creating, all the waste that you're creating, all the economic jugglery that you're doing is actually killing the only space we have to live on.
Yeah.
You're committing suicide. One of the definitions of insanity is actually doing more of the same, hoping that there will be a change.
Machinery that convinces us to drink Coca-Cola and actually feel like it's good for health, or sell diamonds to express love. It's a whole machinery that has like hypnotized us.
Doing more of the same, what we did before, is definitely not leadership. If you and I are living in the same place, then tit for tat will work, no?
When an outsider comes
punish you, the moment an outsider comes in, the whole equation goes out. And we have a crisis. We have a crisis of leadership. We have a crisis that all of us are facing.
Welcome to the Bodhi Sangha Podcast, where we come together to listen, learn, and support each other in uncertain times. We're a community exploring how to face today's challenges with wisdom, trust, and care. Join us as we walk this journey of change, rooted in connection and guided by life's deeper wisdom.
Namaste Raghu, Pranam, and welcome to yet another conversation between us about issues, questions, and this time we have the conversation around leadership, topic of leadership, which is really, really at the heart of so much that's happening. But just a quick introduction. Raghu, I've stopped introducing people now with what, because I think everybody, everywhere it's written what. I think I'd like to introduce more what you mean to me and how you've been impactful. So
Sure.
Just that for the audience, Raghu is an elder, a teacher, somebody who spent decades in yoga and then bringing ancient wisdom to contemporary lenses. I know of his work through the Mahabharata Immersion, which is a very, very powerful program. And that program's kind of transformed how I look at life, how I look at the world, how I look at India, how I look at colonization. And I think having you as an elder, having you as a mentor, somebody who voices the voice of this land is a huge blessing. So I think thank you so much for making time for this conversation, Raghu. I'm really excited. I think the conversation before this for us to sync up, I think was really, really got me really excited about this conversation. And I think just to originate this conversation, I think, Raghu, you've written a lot about various aspects of the Indic tradition, of leadership, of Dharma. But the intent of these three conversations was to bring together a lot of these in a way that we kind of have a compact view on what we are kind of postulating as the Indic way of leadership. And like you said, before we even start talking about leadership, we need to speak about the context in which this leadership is located in today's time. So maybe that's what we could start with. How do you look at this context, these times we are living in, and why first context and then leadership? Like, why is context so central? Why not just talk about 3 tips of leadership, the 3 ways to lead? Here's yet another model of leadership. Like, why the context and what is the context?
A couple of things, yeah. There is a huge confusion between a leader and leadership. Simply because somebody is sitting in a CEO's chair or whatever the label is, that signifies that this person is in a leadership position, does not mean immediately that the person is acting in ways that are helping the group, the community, or the company that he's supposed to be helping, right? It's just a title. So leadership is something which is an active thing which we have to understand, right? And I don't think that one person, especially in today's context, can be the leader or whatever you want to say in every context, because the world has become extremely wide and the specializations and understandings that you need to get a comprehensive idea of what's going on is very wide. So the idea of a leader has to be jettisoned. Yeah. I think most CEOs know this because Jack Welch had actually created a context which he called the CEO's office. And several very, very high-profile people who have later on become CEOs of other organizations were all part of his team. And that team was taking decisions while he might have been the icon for the outside world. So let's look at why a context. Yeah, because leading is something that I or you delegate to a person, yeah, so that that person can take us in a direction which is helpful for my life and your life, and if it's a community, the community life, and so on. So it's actually a power that I have to deal with my entirety of my life to somebody, because I think, and the reality is, I cannot manage every aspect of my life. I need a context in which to grow. I cannot create my entire context. Right? Now, therefore, a community or a nation or whatever decides to delegate certain aspects to other people. Like if I want to protect myself and you want to protect yourself, we cannot. We are living in a nation. We have agreed to be a citizen of this nation. We have to delegate it to an army. We have to delegate certain things to a foreign office, so on and so forth. So each of these positions is actually a way in which we are asking these people and we trust these people to help us to grow. The old Indian idea of this is a very beautiful idea, right? It has two contexts. Now, one is called the Raja Dharma. So I trust whoever is playing the role of the Raja to do things so that every blade of grass in the country that he's supposed to be governing is looked after and enabled to flourish. I think this is a great idea. I don't think anybody is doing it today. If they were, then we won't be cutting down the Amazon the way we are, and the destruction that's happening to our environment will not happen. The other idea is also very, very important. It says there are three aspects to governance. Yeah, one is called dharma, which is the word that you started with. Here, dharma means that I flourish and everything around me flourishes through my actions. Right? This is very similar to the idea of Ubuntu that you find in South Africa. I am because you are. And we are because the world around us is, and so on. So that is the dharmic anchor. The second is called Danda. So Dandam is a set of rules and policies that enable all of us to be sure that everybody, whether we know that person or not, is going to be following a set of rules. So it becomes easy for me to move around. I can feel safe and sure that if I trade with you, for example, it's a fair trade. And the third is very important, which is specific, I think, to Indic thought, which is Mukti. Mukti here means that each individual who's being governed has to be enabled to have their own spiritual journey and ultimate liberation. Yeah, the Native American, the people of the Turtle Islands, had a very interesting idea of leadership. They said that a leader is one who enables every member of his tribe to live in peace and act with honor. I think these are very beautiful concepts, right? So the entire thing is in a context. I mean, a tribe is living in a forest land or a whatever that place is. And my leadership has to be, if I'm the person leading the tribe, in such a way that everybody flourishes in that context. Right? Otherwise, what happens if I, as a leader, or you, as a leader, is not aware of the context? You're only acting for your personal benefit and your personal power. That's when it becomes adharmic. So it's extremely important to ask 3 questions. Now, as a group of people, right now, as human beings, who are we? Where are we? And why are we here? Right? Now, these questions obviously have a certain historic continuity. I'm just not suddenly alive today. I'm part of a continuity. Right? So therefore, one has to understand today's context and understand how this has come to be. Why are we here? And then what is the next step? That is where leadership comes in. Leadership has to take us to the next step so that we can all flourish. That's the idea. Right? And it doesn't take too much to see that there is not even one leader on the horizon today who seems to be doing this. And we have a crisis. We have a crisis of leadership. We have a crisis that all of us are facing. And that's even the World Economic Forum has understood that there's a crisis. So they publish in 2023, they published a World Risk Evaluation Report or something like that it's called, which talks about the poly crisis. And there's a map, there's a systems map of what this poly crisis means. And to my horror, it's not at all very different from the systems picture that was published by Forrester and the group that worked on the Club of Rome report in the 70s. It's just a little more polished because you have better computers today. So what that report told me was that the human beings and the leadership has done nothing about several of the aspects of the crisis which were stated clearly in 1970s and or that time period till 2023. That's about 50 years. So today we are faced with a really huge problem, right? And you know that there's the Swedish group that is looking at what they're calling the planetary boundaries. And they're looking at 9 of them. They're saying that 5 or 6 has already been breached. So human beings today are living at a point when there is a crisis. And the current crisis, the way all of these people are talking about it, is not going to enable everybody and every blade of grass to flourish. In fact, the destruction, the ecocide and so on that they're talking about. Recently, I heard something about an idea called semiocide, which is languages, ways of understanding, and the whole knowledge systems which are not necessarily human knowledge systems, just getting wiped out. So that is the context. What is leadership in this context is what we have to ask. Because there's enough been written about the colonizing context that has brought us here.
Sure. I think, in fact, I'll segue into contrasting the colonizing context in which a lot of leadership literature already exists, and a lot of leadership is in a particular context that comes from a different era. I was, when you were sharing about every blade of grass being taken care of, I was contrasting it to how today all the dark triad people have occupied places of power and are actually literally like sucking energy and making it more and more about themselves and evoking primal fears, and instead of creating security, shaking things up. And sometimes it feels like to be the image that comes is that we are a bunch of so-called evolved apes, but the fight has gone out of control and we're like all sitting and we don't know what's going on. And we're making it worse and worse with every round, right? Everybody's acting against everybody, and it's like a race to the bottom that we seem to have stuck into. And I'm wondering how much of this crisis is a crisis of leadership, right? Not being able to identify leadership, not being able to upregulate the right set of people who can make the right decisions. Like the mess that we have created is a mess of decisions. And I wonder if decisions are taken by leaders or communities who promote certain type of people. I don't know. So just want to understand this whole mess and this
Possibly many
context.
of these things, no, Abhishek?
Yeah.
So let's just try and unpack it, pack it a little bit, no? See, we have to understand that till recently, na, let's say till 400-500 years back, which is quite recent in the evolutionary thing, we lived in communities, more or less intact communities, right? So if I'm born into a certain landmass, if I'm born into Tamil Nadu, let's say, at that point of time, let's say 500 years back, it was probably called Cholanadu or Cholamanda, something like that. The likelihood of my living there and dying there is very high. Working there, everything is very high, right? So you had communities which more or less lived together. Now, this has a great consequence. Now, ideas like Ubuntu and Dharma are born in a context like this. Right, the
You mean like a long uninterrupted context of community living, which is geographically rooted. Yeah.
So what happens, how you behave impacts me very definitely, and how I behave impacts you in a long-term survival context. Right? Now, this has been studied by the neo-Darwinians in a very interesting experiment that they do, where they have looked at two behaviors of intact communities and run it through the computer and things like that. Yeah, it's a simulation. So what are the two possible actions of every individual in the community? One is to act for self-preservation and so on. The other is to act in an altruistic way. So we call the first action X and the second action Y. Yeah, a lot of management games are played. This is also the development of the game theory and so on. So X is a self-centered action. So they've run it in communities and found that when the whole community more or less is practicing the X way, self-centered way, it seems to rise up and there is a lot of dynamism, but it dies down very quickly because there's a huge amount of mutual extraction, mistrust, so on and so forth, and the community as such breaks down. What happens when you have a long-term Y game, no? Altruism and so on? They find that there's a little bit of a steady state that carries on for a longer time, but dynamism or something like that of growth is sort of dying down, right? They're very comfortable. So then they figured out what happens. What's the combination of X and Y game? So there they talk about something called a tit for tat. So if I behave in an altruistic way, you will behave in an altruistic way. The moment you behave in a self-centered way, I will punish you for it. Yeah? Somehow, this seems to be creating a more stable and a more prosperous community because there is a certain, like this is very close to the Danda Dharma Mukti I was talking about. Right? Now, this context gets completely vitiated when colonizing happens. Right? So if you read Amitabh Ghosh's book, the Nutmeg's Curse.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, you should read it if you want to feel depressed about life. It starts, the first chapter is about a little island called the Danda Island, if I remember the name right, which is growing nutmeg. It's near Indonesia. And the Dutch East India Company comes there for trade. There's already a flourishing trade in nutmeg in that local area and all the way up to India, Arabia, so on, because nutmeg is very useful for preserving food and it's a nice condiment. So the Dutch East India Company has discovered this and suddenly found that there's a great market for it in Europe. So they want to secure the supply. The supply chain has to be secured. And they have to compete against other foreign players from Europe who are coming in looking for nutmeg. So they come to this little place to make a deal. And how do they come? They come in a gunboat. Right? And then obviously, like today's tariff game, they try to force a deal. And there's a whole tension that's described there, and something sparks the tension. The gunboat unleashes fire, and that island with a population that was stable, that had its own ways of being, is decimated. The people there run away to the nearby hills, and that whole place is converted into a plantation. And many of the people who are captured are forced to work almost as slaves in the lands that they owned. Now, this little parable is the whole story almost of the last 500 years. And what happens here? Reciprocal altruism goes out to the window. There is only self-aggrandizement. And that too by a force which is foreign to the land. Right? If you look at most literature about growth and endless growth and GDP and all of that, it's all based on this model. Economy, as we are using it now, and how we calculate profit is based on this model. Right? Only, if you look at the way Europe made money, it has very few resources, doesn't have that many people, and so on. So what does it do? It comes to the world in gunboats, decimates. Benin, such great civilizations are all flattened out. They have an idea called terra nullius, which says if a land is not owned by Christians, you can go and take it over and things like that. So you just grab resources without paying for it at all. Right? You employ slave labor, extract materials, and you only cost for the marginal cost of extraction, taking it to England or wherever in Europe, converting it and selling it back to these people like it happened in India. Right? You take cotton from here, extractively, and so on. Yeah, that is still the economic model. Replenishment of raw materials, replenishment of anything is not part of your costing. You try and keep labor costs as low as possible and call it labor arbitrage. And so on. Right. Now, all of these are aspects of the same thought, that I can go, plunder, come back, use it for my growth and not pay the price of the wastage I create or the human cost I create and so on. Right? So all of these are called externalities. We have come to a stage when this kind of an idea of human growth and human development is the crisis that we see. That's where we have come to with this idea of human beings. Yeah, the idea of individuals, idea of profit, the idea of GDP. All of these are all based on a fundamental premise that is not going to enable flourishing. Very, very clear.
Yeah, I think a few things open up, Raghu. I think one is that we're also, corporations particularly promote people who can extract the most and externalize the most, because you want the person in charge who's able to kind of maximize profits or returns on shareholders for a lot of corporations. And then what happens when one group does that is that the other group has no choice but to kind of upregulate a similar person, right? Because it's like a battle, right? Like when one group has kind of an extractive leader or who's constantly kind of coming from a violent stance, then unconsciously I feel the other groups also kind of end up selecting an equal kind of bully, right? Like you end up matching extraction for extraction. Like you lose the whole kind of dharmic context around it, right? And I was wondering, sorry, you see.
Of course,
I was wondering, and I was wondering also, Raghu, in the tit for tat example, just to link that, one of the things that in that same simulation that they kind of say that it makes sense to forgive one mistake, because in case somebody makes a mistake, then the whole system can go for a downward loop, because tit for tat will quickly ripple into self-centered action. So when I played that,
if it's only mutual extraction, it goes down.
It goes to the bottom.
But if you and I are living in the same place, then tit for tat will work, no?
Yeah.
It's good.
When an outsider comes
punish you, the moment an outsider comes in, the whole equation goes out.
Yeah, and I think the problem then is that when you treat the outsider as if it's an insider and come from a space of harmony, but the outsider comes from an outsider extractive thing, then it's a disaster, because you're still operating from a peace mindset and you're trying to be mutually harmonious. The outsider is very clearly there to extract and not treat it like their own. And then that race to the bottom, which is what I think you're speaking to.
The race to the bottom, Abhishek, has another historical context. See, before the colonizing process started, there's been a long, I think 1,000 years or something like that, of constant war among the European nations. And finally, there is this very big touted thing called the Westphalian Treaty and all of that. If you look at it carefully, the underlying principle of it is balance of power. Okay, so these treaties are balance of power treaties. So what does it mean? It means that I can sign a treaty, go back and start polishing my sword. So the moment the balance of power equation changes, then I become possible for me to attack you. So the balance of power theory is a very, very extractive theory. That mutual, altruism and all that we're talking is not a balance of power treaty. Yeah, it's also equally saying it's a deep sharing. Altruism is fundamentally sharing. And what are you saying no to? I'm saying no to any trade practices or things like that where you try to dominate me and say domination is not on. Right? So what is the fundamental rule on which Indian society was built? It is built on the idea of ahimsa. Ahimsa paramo dharma. What does ahimsa mean fundamentally? It means I will live the way I'm living, you live the way you're living, don't impinge on me. Right? Trade with me honestly, satya, so on and so forth. Now, this is illustrated very beautifully in a story that Thich Nhat Hanh relates in a book called, I think it's called Old Paths, White Clouds or something, where a group of people who are following the Buddhist tradition when Buddha is alive come to the Buddha and say, look, there are two of our preceptors who keep on fighting among themselves on matters of doctrine and what you're teaching us. So what do we do? It's disturbing our practice. So the Buddha says, tell me what is X saying, what is Y saying. So these people tell him, the followers of X say this is what he's saying, the followers of Y say this is what he's saying. He listens carefully and says, I'm not sure. You guys go and practice for a year and come back and let's see which is more meaningful. Yeah, I found this profound, yeah. This is the meaning of ahimsa, no? You don't go around doing all this. You go and practice, find out what's the truth. Come back, share that, and let's see which one actually works. And look at the openness of the Buddha to say, I don't know. Right? Now, these are all factors which are very critical for an intact community. Right? Now, the moment this balance is shaken up, you have all the hegemonic practices. You can come back to me from wherever you're coming back, and if you say you're looking different from me, I can kill you or convert you. Right? That is not ahimsa. That is clear himsa. And I can then go away. Na? After I inflict whatever I want on you, I can go away. I'm not here to pay the price. I can come here, shoot, and before you figure out what's happening, I can go away.
And I think then the whole thing is not about experimenting and finding truth, but dominating your own truth through force and violence and pushing people to a certain worldview, and then kind of, I don't know.
What?
Yeah.
For what?
For dominance, I guess, and extraction
For
and
dominance,
profit.
and you're creating wealth. Europe is a poor land. All its wealth is taken from other places.
Yeah.
Right. Trevor Noah talks about it very beautifully in a short clip where he talks about how people came to India and what happened. Na? You should watch that clip. It defines this process so beautifully, na? Where this guy comes in his trumpet and he says something. He says, my God. He says, there are so many gods. Which one? And finally, that guy gets desperate and shoots. So all these guys say, okay, whatever you say is fine. It captures this whole process really brilliantly.
Yeah, and linking this back to leadership, Raghu, because most of the leadership is situated in that paradigm. The modern management literature and leadership.
Exactly.
It inherits those values, even if it quotes them in softer terms. The deep intrinsic kind of motivation is still a very self-centered motivation.
That is how, sometime back, what was talked about in the HR circles, and greed is good. Right? So, yeah, that is a fact. And this is, the consequences of it is very simple. Yeah, you have less than 0.5% of America owning more than 50%, no? The bottom 50% or something. Those are the statistics. It will be similar in most countries. Now, this kind of an extractive process and huge differences between people and between nations and so on, where some nations are eternally kept poor and others are kept rich, is all because of this model. I mean, if you're watching some stuff nowadays coming out of Africa, there are lots of economists who have studied economics today who are asking the question, how can any African nation be poor? Cobalt comes from there, copper comes from there, everything that you need for today's industry comes from there. Right? So it ought to be rich, no? It's very rich in raw materials. It's because of this economic policy that they remain poor. And then they get into debt cycles. And then you have all kinds of other ways of keeping this going. So how can any action that furthers this be called leadership in a context where there is a crisis? This way of cycling resources and cycling money is clearly the cause of unsustainability that we are faced with today. Yeah, I can joke about it, Abhishek. I'm 74 plus. Yeah, till now I was very sure that I would, die before all this crap hits the ceiling. But I'm not so sure anymore. But definitely, in your lifetime, you're going to face it.
Yeah.
What is leadership for you?
I think, what for me, the leadership of these times, I think what one of the things I've learned from you and in general is that one is that the adharmic people actively have identified other insecure adharmic people and placed them all into like a whole nexus of extraction and profit and kind of dominated. Like they've created a whole network of extractors and people. And I think for me, and greed and like fully put their hands.
Victimhood and greed.
Yeah. For me, Raghu, one of the things I think which I picked from a lot inspired by your work was the idea of the Yug Dharma and the calling of the times. And when I think about leadership in my context, I say, hey, I'm a great facilitator. I love facilitating. I'll do my workshops, for example, and that is valuable. And yet I felt I was being called to say not just that, right? There is something larger out there that I need to show up, and I can't stand and say, that's not me. I feel for me, leadership today is going beyond these ideas of, oh, that's not me, I won't do this, to do what it takes to reclaim that power to the virtuous people. Like, I feel leadership is like bringing power and virtue together, right? Like, how do we reclaim power and bring it to virtuous people? And how can virtuous people be powerful, right? And to trust in my own goodness and say that I'm going to go into the world, I'm going to show up and I'm going to challenge and I'm going to reclaim that power and bring it back to service of the whole. I mean, that's what comes to me, right? That's what you inspired us to do. That's what you kind of equipped us to do.
Yeah, that's
right?
very important.
Yeah.
See, Abhishek, if we look at this carefully now, we are not starting from zero. Touch now with some international groups of people, largely indigenous people, who are looking at what is our answer to the current times. Do we have an answer? And it's very, very interesting that many of the ideas like Dharma and all that you're talking about are echoed by almost all indigenous people, because they're all intact communities. That's where their idea of life has come from. Right? Now, the idea of reclaiming power has its own difficulties and its own problems. Okay, I've been having a lot of discussions with some of these people, and then Steve and I have been having a lot of discussions about it. I think, we've been working a lot on decolonization. What does it mean? Right, this idea of reclaiming ends up with you versus me again. And to me, it seems like I'm internalizing the oppressor. Ashish Nandi has written about it in his book called The Intimate Enemy. We are thinking that maybe today's leadership is something that will ask the question, how do we humanize again? Because there are lots of Western authors also talking about how this whole colonizing process has dehumanized the colonizer as much as the colonized. Yeah, there's a very interesting book called My Grandmother's Hands. What's the name of the author? I'm forgetting. It's a black person who's working on how do you get out of this blackness in the mind. Now, when you look at all of this, you can't get back into a retaliatory thing. Right? We might have to today, I think, like what Gandhiji did was very, very powerful, no? He simply said, I'm not going to cooperate with whatever is adharmic. And I'm going to then build something which will have the kind of values that I think helps the flowering. So he talked about Swarajya. He talked about Swatantrata and so on. And every time violence happened, he didn't, he stopped the movement and said, let's cleanse ourselves and anchor ourselves in a assertion, in Satya Agraha. So today, what I'm thinking is that you need Dharma Agraha, not as a fight against something, but as a standing up for a dharmic way of living, which goes back to some of these fundamentals that we spoke about as dharmic living, but it has to learn from the past. See, today we have technology, we have ways of communication and so on. Can each of them actually act in dharmic ways? Can Facebook, for example, stop making money out of selling data and selling its background stuff to a Cambridge Analytica and increasing the processes of colonizing the mind and giving you false information in order to protect some political ideology? And not even that. I don't think Facebook is interested in a political ideology. They're only interested in making money.
Yeah.
So what is the alternative? How does this alternative get nourished? How do you help that to grow? To me, that is leadership. Doing more of the same, what we did before, is definitely not leadership. One of the definitions of insanity is actually doing more of the same, hoping that there will be a change.
Yeah. I think, Raghu, sorry, you were saying something. I was saying that in our context today, I think there's a bunch of techno-optimists and climate deniers who take a stance that there is no crisis. This is the best time of humanity. There's a bunch of people promoting that narrative. Then there's another bunch which is doing performative kind of like, oh, I'll extract profit and then I'll do a little bit of CSR. So my core hasn't changed, but I'm showing as if I care. And then there's a third group that pushes all the alternatives to the fringe constantly by saying, hey, that's like a bunch of new agey woo-woo hippies, or, that's like a revolutionary rebel group. Like, these are all like, throw every alternative to the fringe and keep the mainstream intact, right? So I think a part of it is also exposing these lies, right? The machinery that convinces us to drink Coca-Cola and actually feel like it's good for health, or sell diamonds to express love. There's a whole machinery that has like hypnotized us, right? And it's kept in place by the so-called leaders of these corporations.
Of those systems.
So
exactly.
Then to call out, like, how's this leadership? If this is what you're doing, you're getting people addicted to the screen, then how are you going to B schools and talking like you are the leader? Whereas what you've done is spread a disease in humanity, right? Like, so I think that calling out and being able to call the current leadership models out also, I don't know if enough of that is happening. I sometimes wonder if we are colluding in that way, saying, hey, this is nonsense. But like participating in the nonsense and saying, no, like saying, oh, it's okay. At least there is some good things to learn from that. So I wonder, like, this whole management, and as a B school grad also, like, while we were in B school, we would celebrate a lot of these extractors as saying that,
I know
they're the best, most efficient extractors. And
I know.
And this whole wrapping around the language also, right? Like using soft language to hide, what is serious crimes. So I don't know, this whole hypnosis, I think leadership also in today's day and age would include breaking through this hypnosis, this clutter, to speak what you call the dharmagra, right? Like saying this is not dharmic. So calling out and the act of being able to speak up adequately in adequate numbers, and in gentle ways, like you said, not othering, but really inviting into saying, hey, can you also look at what the impacts are, right? Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Helping everybody to be anchored in their humanness and not in their divisiveness. See, all of these things, the breakdown of mutual altruism, reciprocal altruism, and all that happens when you other. The moment you and I are one, like the Ubuntu concept, if you look at, obviously I have to base my existence on mutual altruism. I need some things from you. You need something from me. The more honest we are in our exchange, obviously both of us can grow. But if I'm being extractive and create distrust, how do we grow? So the moment you allow yourself to be extractive, act on self-preservation or self-aggrandizement at the cost of another. And today it's very, very clear, there is no other. All the cost that you're creating, all the waste that you're creating, all the economic jugglery that you're doing is actually killing the only space we have to live on.
Yeah.
You're committing suicide. It's like poisoning your own home and saying, how powerful I am, kind of a thing, no? It's obviously a wrong thing. However, this has a huge inertia, no? That's why I said to understand where we are today, you have to look at the historical forces, right? Not to condemn it or whatever. It happened at that time. There must have been some reason for it. While we can understand what happened, we are wasting time if you have to condemn it. All that we have to say is, let's look at it and learn.
Yeah, and not repeat.
What are the fundamental mistakes of this? And there are other things. There are so many other examples also. This is not the only example. So how do we learn from all of this and take the next step in a way that is not taking us down
the current road or the crisis road?
There is no current road, Abhishek. It's very, very clear. We are at an inflection point. was very clear, right? You're either going down or you change and you're going in a different path. I mean, what more evidence do you need? Yeah, kind of climate crisis that they predicted in the 70s, it's all happening faster than they predicted. Ice melting is happening faster than they predicted. Global warming is happening faster than they predicted. Water pollution, air pollution, soil depletion, every factor is worsening much faster than it was predicted.
Yeah.
So how much longer would somebody wait? And isn't leadership at this point of time your ability to change this course? And anything you do which is going to be reinforcing the same old thing is moving us further into what is clearly insane.
Yeah. I think, Raghu, what you shared also, just to summarize this, that, for example, I first disconnect, like I don't even consider us one. Then I dehumanize the person and then I extract from the person and then create this relationship of dominance and kind of perpetuate that. And I think one of the things there is also I weaponize things like creativity. Like the creativity today is not regenerative creativity. It's creativity is like cleverness. It's cleverness disguised as creativity, like how to brand this better, how to make it more addictive. But true regenerative creativity could allow us to not extract and create a win-win, like a true win-win. Like I feel like Dharma requires...
When it's win, not just win-win.
Win-win-win, sure. The three wins. The planetary win also,
yes.
right? That's absolutely, yeah. Not just a collusion with each other, but really like... But I'm saying, Raghu, also I'm wondering that tapping into that level of creativity, that truly regenerative, like I'm not going to be creative in how I influence or persuade you or seduce you to extract, but how can I be creative with you so that we're all better off at the end of this? And I'm wondering, what is that switch? Does that begin from the humanization? Does that begin from us tapping into something beyond us? Like what moves, like what's the source of true like life force, that can lead us?
See, Abhishek, at this point, we have to say, I don't know. And with humility, we have to say, let us search. Let's look at alternatives. Let us search. And let us experiment. Right. Now, there are experiments already on. Yeah. Orwell is trying something. There are other communities like this which are saying, what is the alternative? See, just go back to this impact community idea, right? First, one of the things that's obvious is people have to start thinking in terms of all of humanity in one community, right? But that is not so easy. How do you get there? There's a huge problem. So see what's happening in Orwell. People have come from various different places, but for them to look at the whole of Orwell as a single thing, and with the governance practices there, them being one unit which is following a similar idea of emancipation of human beings, helping human beings evolve, is in a huge tension. So what do we learn from places like this? What are the other similar experiments? How do we learn? Yeah, because one of the interesting things about a place like Orwell, is, see, if you go back again, now, when you're a community, and I'm living in Kotagiri, I'm seeing what is happening there with the local community. There's a Badga community. It's very close-knit. But it is still holding in its mind ideas which led to the Badgas coming to the hills. So they'll tell you these stories about how in Tipu's time, they were in Karnataka, their homes and their villages were being pillaged, so they ran away. Their women were being molested, and so on. So what happens here now is the way they live. The women are not allowed to sit outside the veranda for too long unless there's a male member there. Right? So the conditions that created this myth and this idea of a community are long since gone. But the internal processes of this community have not allowed any growth and change. Yeah, so there are a lot of very nice things that they have. The way they have the bhakti thing and everything is very nice. At the same time, there are all these very oppressive things. At least from the outside, when I look at it, it's very oppressive. So what has happened to that community? Right? Some of them have just gone away and become opportunists. So when the British came there, several of them peeled away and became opportunists, got land given to them by the British, all kinds of things. Yeah, so they went away from the community thing. There are a few people who have gone and looked after their own selves. They haven't done this kind of opportunism there itself. They've gone off to America or here, there, wherever. Right? You have a group of people like that. And I'm assuming, if you look at just this as a analogy, there'd have been a few people who go off to Himalayas and saying, I don't like all this. I neither like this extractive thing, nor the opportunistic thing, nor the conservative thing. Let me go off to Himalayas. There are very few who come back and transform society, their own society. Right? Now, that's what Orwell is trying to do in a sense. Give an example of another way of being, which is spiritual, which is economic, and so on and so forth. Right? One has to look at how is this possible? Because there are a lot of people. I'm not the only voice or whatever. I'm not the only... what I'm saying is also drawn from several things I'm reading and several things I'm listening to. By the way, the name of that black author is Resmaa Menakem, My Grandmother's Hands. Beautiful book to read. Right? How do you emancipate? How do you humanize? So critical, because we're all caught with all these things. We're caught with these community belongings. We're caught with religious belongings. And all of us, more or less, have internalized the colonial ways of othering, extracting for yourself, and so on.
Raghu, what's the space for healing and reconciliation? Because also there is so much trauma, right? And so there has to be a process of truth-telling, reconciliation, some healing. Or do we bypass it, or do we say, okay, everything is forgiven, let's move on? Like, what's that process like, so that there is a rehumanizing on all sides, right? With us, with the colonizers also. Like, what truth and reconciliation work do you feel is?
This truth and reconciliation, now that I'm not so clear about. I don't know. Yeah. See, the work we are doing now is to really help people look at their own realities clearly. So we actually have a 5-6 day very intense program where we try and simulate this whole colonizing process. Yeah. What is it to be a white, wearing white masks, black masks? What happened in that interchange? And there are lots of writing about this. So we look at that and then we imitate this. Yeah. One black author has very clearly talked about what happened in his country, Nigeria, I think, remember right? He says, first, when these people came, we invited them in. We are nice people. This is how we live. We don't look at like India, Atiti Devo. This guy came. It's a lot of enough. There is no thing. We showed them, this is where we have gold. This is where we have diamond. So this guy, Dr. Livingston or somebody, he jokes about. He says, come, Dr. Livingston, see, watch all of this here. Proudly, we showed him. We even gave him a couple of diamonds because, fine, we live in this kind of community and this altruism and all this kind of way. He says, we didn't know that he was going to go back and bring along with him people who were proselytizers, people who were so-called explorers and so on. And very soon behind them were the businessmen and the military. And before we knew what was happening, we have believed that, if you get slapped in one cheek, you have to show the other cheek. And we have lost our gods. We've lost our land, we've lost our sovereignty, and this is where we are today. I forget the name of this person, Bishop somebody. Very interestingly, he talks. Right? He says, what do we do now? So we recreate this story. And the critical thing in this story is a set of blacks become the browns. They become the lackeys, or they become the boys, like they're calling it now, of the whites, because they see personal advantage. So you actually have a context of three sets of people: the blacks, the whites, and the browns. Right? So we recreate this. And to understand the browns, you have to read about the poor whites in America who were used to oversee the slaves, how they were treated. Right? Indians are the poor whites. We are the browns. Right? You see all over the world. Now we've been taken there as overseers. Right? And this kind of stuff. In Africa, many places like this, right? Many Indians have become brown. Every indigenous community, there will be browns. So now it's all of us. I mean, each of us is very, very deeply conflicted. Right? There are parts of our own community belonging which we have learned to hate. There are other parts which we love. We don't know how to reconcile this. Don't know who we are. Right? We will never be accepted as the whites, ever. Because right now what's happening in the world is very clearly coming together of the European things to hold down to their domination. Right? You've forgotten exactly how to live like your tradition. You've lost your blackness. Who are you? Right? Now, each of these groups has a resource. So this is the big if, which we have to explore. We all discover how to be human beings first, and not Indians or Americans or Africans or whatever, or Hindu or Muslim and all that. Then there is a possibility of saying, oh, let's stop this stupid othering. Let's stop this colonizing, dominating, or my resource security, my way of life. I mean, the American way of life is not American, man. It's costing the whole world. Yeah, when one nation with such a small population eats up a huge percentage of world's resources, ensures that the Amazon is broken up because they need corn for their beef, or they need beef or something like that. It's not American way of life. Yeah. Europe's wealth is completely based on low-cost labor in other nations and extracting resources from other nations and things like this. Right? So if these processes will stop only if there is an understanding that all these divisions are disastrous. The colonizing ways of living and the colonizing ways of looking at economy are leading us to the crisis. How can we recover humanness first? See, the fact that you're a Thakur and I'm a Raghu Ananthanarayanan cannot be changed, yaar.
That's happy.
But I have a choice of not getting stuck inside it, not getting imprisoned into it.
Yeah.
And realizing that you and I are human beings.
Yeah. Raghu, one last question maybe, and I mean, as we're coming closer to closing this first part, is two things open up for me. One is the possibility of brownness. One is the conflict of brownness, but there's also a possibility that as you are brown, you understand these views and you could actually be the bridge, the healer, the kind of the people who kind of come to the world and remind the world that, hey, there is a oneness, because, and I think that's one question or one possibility. Yeah. So one is that kind of, if you have something on that. And the other is also, Raghu, inside us also there is the black, brown and white, right? Like in the sense that when a colonizer comes into a community, it latches onto those people in the community who will convert first to that extraction. So I'm saying also within us, there are adharmic forces also waiting, right? Like any half intelligent person today can be extractive, can place themselves close to the system, just extract. And so I think also I'm wondering that this internal battle also, right? Like there's an external challenge, but there's also this internal temptation to switch sides, right? Or there is a temptation in people, or there are people who don't have the awareness and are already on an extractive side. So just wondering about both these things, the possibility of brownness and the
two. Abhishek, there is not two. There's only one. There's only the internal. The external is clearly a reflection of the internal. There is no two. And nor is it, let's explore this further. Now, it's not the browns can do this with the whites. Everybody has to drop out their current definitions of themselves, their current identity patterns, and anchor themselves first on being human. Right. Then there is a possibility. And see, one of the critical things that Krishnaji, J. Krishnamurti has said, that being well adjusted to a sick society is not evidence of sanity or something to that effect. So you should extend that to leadership. Leading a society which is sick into greater and greater sickness, to greater and greater repetition of the same. So that be leadership.
Absolutely.
Right. What is the new step? What is it that will take us away from this disastrous path?
Yeah.
Is leadership.
I think I'm wondering, Raghu, that creating safety for people, because for me to, when I'm unsafe, I cling on to more identities and become more and more narrow. When I feel safer, I relax into broader and broader identities. So I'm also wondering that in today's context where people are feeling anxious, unsafe, and even more polarized, is leadership also kind of sheltering them from this context and actually creating safety enough for people to say, okay, it feels safe to take on my humanness and not cling to any other identity as a victim or for validation. So I'm wondering if there is a role.
Let's explore these possibilities. Let's explore them, because I know we are trying some things. There are a lot of people trying other things. So let's explore what these possibilities are.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't want to just give a quick answer. The reality is I don't know. The reality is I'm experimenting. So the Dharma Graha program, the immersion, we are doing one immersion very soon for people who've been through our kind of, intense work with Mahabharata immersion that you talked about in the beginning. We are calling it the Kaurava immersion. Exactly the question you're asking. Can I go into myself and discover who is the Duryodhana in me? Who is the Shakuni in me? Instead of pretending that I am a Pandava and everybody else is a Kaurava kind of stuff. Now, Jung has talked about it quite a bit, that unless I can embrace my shadow, I can never become whole. So the whole process of othering that he talks about is when I don't own up to my shadow and I project the shadow on you and continuously look at you as the shadow and me as the angelic. Right? These are all deep psychological processes that need to be examined.
True.
So there are experiments. We can speculate. I don't think we can say I know. Right? What we say very clearly is what is to be avoided, because there's history for that. There is evidence for that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's a good, what they call cliffhanger for our next podcast, which is to say that this is what we'll kind of explore, what stances, what possibilities are, and kind of inquire together into it. But yeah, I think that this was an amazing exploration of the context in which we're even inquiring into leadership. So thank you, Raghu. Any final thoughts before we pause? Lovely. Thank you so much then. And Pranam, and we'll continue this exploration with 2 more podcasts, which further now go into something more specific. So thank you, and thank you everybody for listening. Thanks a lot.